Welcome back to the Flower Essence podcast. Today, we are excited to talk about the intersection of flower essences and astrology with our special guest, Isha Lerner. Isha is an international astrologer, a tarot scholar, consultant, teacher, and best-selling author who has been working with and researching flower essences for about 35 years. She has published the Power of Flowers deck, the Tarot of the Four Elements, the Triple Goddess Tarot, and the Inner Child Fairy Tale Tarot cards. Isha's work bridges across countries and cultures and was honored to be part of the magical early days of the Findhorn community in Northern Scotland from 1976 to 1980, where her deep work with the co-creation of humanity and nature was inspired. Her understanding and experiences with out of body and paranormal states of consciousness lives at the root of her transformational work as a teacher and a healer. Her many years of work in this field has inspired her to research the meaning of incarnation and evolution through past life research, her astrological karmic imprint work, and the study of mystical meaning of fairy tales, myth, and archetypes. Wow, it's quite a realm of things that you are just immersed in that we all love. And we are so excited to have you on the podcast, Isha. Welcome.
Thank you so
Welcome.
much.
We're really glad to have you here.
Thank you. I'm real happy to be here.
Yeah, we're excited about this conversation. We've been really wishing and hoping to have someone to come to talk with us about this intersection of astrology and flowers. Rochana and I are both interested in astrology, not professional astrologers, but very interested in it. And it does inform our practices. And we wanted to have somebody on who could really talk more in depth about how these two fields intersect. So we're really glad to have you.
Yeah.
And I think that we'll just start from the beginning. How did you get involved in both of these fields, and how did you start, integrating and merging them together?
I think the first piece that is most important for me personally was finding that there was something more in the world than just the material world that I could touch and see. So I think many of us, probably a lot of your listeners, have always felt there's something more to the world and that we want more out of the world in terms of an understanding of those of us that have had out of body experiences, those of us who feel that there is greater meaning in the world and want to create a story of our life that carries that mystery and that meaning. So I felt that way in my early teens. And like most early teens, I was involved in, high school and cheerleading and everything else that I did. But I always felt different. I always felt like I don't fit in. And that feeling of not fitting in pushed me toward, an exploration of, would it be back in that day, more like poetry and music. And I found Robert Monroe's work and found a tarot deck when I was 18 years old. I actually was given a tarot deck. And I just, went to it like a fish to water. And just felt like, oh my goodness, I know this. It's almost like from a past life. I knew it from somewhere else. And so that kind of began this feeling that there's more out there. I found Krishnamurti, I found Joseph Campbell, I found Carl Jung's work, Rudolf Steiner's work. And this is what, connected to all these pieces that were, connected to myth and magic and archetype and psychology. And then later into the field of astrology and tarot. For me, by the time I was about 20, I was immersed in that world. Moved to the Hawaiian Islands. My soul opened like a blossoming flower. And I just, from there on out, my entire life has been immersed in these studies. So, how some people have a career or some people have work, I think probably you would agree. And those of us who are in this field, it's our life. It isn't really a career, although it is, but it's our life and it's what we do. And those of us blessed enough to turn it into a career, that has, fulfilled us with our purpose and destiny. I would say that that has been one of the greatest honors I feel, is that I could turn all of this work and interesting study and curiosity, and of course, hard work into, a lifelong work is both connected to who I am and the work I do in the world.
Wonderful. And I just have to ask, how was Findhorn? And for those who don't or haven't heard of that, it's an island in Scotland. And it was an early play. And I don't really know a lot about it, but I just, every time I hear about it, my soul kind of goes, oh my God, I wish I, could have experienced that, or I still want to go and check it out. It just sounds amazing. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Well, those of us, again, who are involved in this world, of creating story and following, in a sense, as Joseph Campbell would say, our bliss, that isn't necessarily that easy to do. I mean, there's a lot of focus and hard work connected to staying on path and staying on purpose. And when I lived in Hawaii, I went on a backpacking trip and went through all the islands. And I ran into a woman who had the book, The Magic of Findhorn, and this was in the early 70s. And she just had finished reading it and said, hey, this is a cool book. Do you want to read it? So I was like, yeah, sure. So I consumed the book in a day. And when I returned back to my home on Oahu, where I rented a room in Manoa Valley back in the day, it was this beautiful jungle area. The person who had subletted my room had just returned from Findhorn, and he was one of the major people that had started the Findhorn kitchens, and he was, a prominent member of the Findhorn community. And it was magical to meet up with him, and a surprise that I had just learned about Findhorn. And that's how everything for many of us works, right? The law of synchronicity and those magical moments that change our life forever. And so we had met, we clicked, and 2 days later, he received a letter from Peter Caddy, who's the founder, one of the founders of the Findhorn community, along with Eileen Caddy and Dorothy McLean. And he said, can you come back to the community? We've just purchased the Clooney Hill Hotel, which is like a castle in the forest. And we're going to turn it from a 5-star hotel into the community learning center. But there was a transition that needed to take place. And he said, do you know any cooks to come with you? Well, I had been working at a vegetarian restaurant called La Lima on Oahu. And Christopher looked at me and said, do you want to go to Findhorn? And I said, I do. And Peter Caddy sent us tickets. And before I knew it, and again, the wink of an eye, I was sailing over the skies to Scotland, to Findhorn. And really, many people who have found their way to Findhorn back in those days, the stories are very similar. It was just kind of like we were invited in a way, and it was really beautiful back in those days to be, in a way, creating a university school that is still in process today. But of course, with the pandemic and everything else that's changing in the world, it has had a strong impact on the community and how it can actually offer visitors and classes and whatnot. So there's a lot of transition going on, and it has been going on for a long time at Findhorn. But the keynote of Findhorn, for those of you who don't know, is the beautiful co-creation between humanity and nature. And Peter Caddy and Eileen Caddy, and particularly Dorothy McLean, had this beautiful connection to the Davic world and the communication with plants. And they were featured in a lot of different books at the time. In the 70s, a lot of Renaissance kind of thought was taking place. And one of those beautiful connections to nature and connections to a universal thought program was that we are not separate, from the plant world, from the animal kingdom, that we can, in a sense, connect to the higher meaning and messaging of the plants, the trees, the flowers around us. With that, there was tremendous gardening, there was community spirit, there was hard work and group consciousness that was taking place, and a lot of personality work as well, because once, as we know, we enter into community, there's a lot of our own ego bashing that takes place. And who are we within this greater context, whatnot. So yeah, Findhorn was an incredible opportunity. I feel so blessed. I was there from 1976 through 81. I got married at Findhorn and I had my first daughter in Scotland. And it, was just an incredible piece of very pertinent experience that sort of held a foundation of a certain level of community spirit and lessons, that were there to teach us young troubadours as we were to go out in the world and do our work.
And this is where this seed of flower essences was planted for you. I'm familiar
Yeah,
with the connection with the Devic realm, and
yeah,
how do you see the essences coming into play in this experience that you had at Findhorn and
yeah.
that deep community of co-creation?
Yeah, well, it was in Hawaii actually that, and this is a true story. And I never took drugs, never was interested in drugs, mainly because there's mental illness in my family, and for me, I didn't want to mess around with my brain. So as much as people say that dropping acid or doing mushrooms is a great thing to do to open your spectrum, I feel like mine was already open, and that is not from an ego place; it's from a painful place because I had to integrate a lot of my mental. Um, kind of networking, to remain focused and to remain clean and clear. And so I was backpacking in Kauai and Waimea Canyon, and it was the most beautiful and enchanting evening. And this had happened a couple of times before, but this one particularly changed my life. Within the wink of an eye again, within the blink of an eye, whatever, all of nature, and again, this is not drug induced, turned into light. And I was instructed or given kind of an intuitive understanding that everything is light and moving light and energy. And I could see through the plants, everything became fluorescent, and then boom, it was gone. It was like a curtain, opened it and closed it. And I knew that something extraordinary had happened, that I knew that I could actually put my hand through those plants if I could only shift vibration, and I could work at the speed of that higher vibrational plant energy. And it isn't hierarchical, better or lower or higher. It's just the gravity and the essence between the atomic world and the energy world and vibrational world. And so we as humans, we obviously vibrate at a slower pace in order to be of form. And the plant world vibrates at a different level. And so does, the energy of trees and the energy of light and sound. It's all vibration, as we know. And I got it. I knew. And I came again when I returned back to Hawaii. I had been given, before I went to Hawaii, actually, an original set of Bach flowers, the 32 essences. I still have that very old original set. And I knew there was something magical about these little bottles of elixir, and I was really interested in them. And of course, Edward Bach, I began to read his teachings and enchanted with him. And I feel like he's still my mentor and still someone that, I mean, we probably all feel this way about certain people, but I feel I knew him. I mean, I just feel a connection with Edward Bach, and almost like an invitation from some source that I could go to his place of origin, which I did, and to be able to study the Bach flower remedies. And I brought them with me to Findhorn. And I met a man at Findhorn who was an elder, and he was an amazing person. He's not with us any longer. And he was doing Touch for Health, and he was doing all these incredible, early on healing techniques, and he was using the Bach flower remedies. And so I remember he did a testing on me, and the first remedy that I received, and I felt embarrassed by it. I received larch, and he was like, well, you're not confident, or, you have to work on your larch, your confidence. And it was exposure. I felt, no, I don't want to be seen like that. And I realized that is the beginning of self-awareness and self-reflection, and that flower essences could tap into the parts of our inner life that could clear and cleanse and re-imprint and help us, like a flower or a plant, to work with original signatures of who we are. So yes, I began to work with flower essences at Findhorn. originally with the Bach flower remedies. And I was also studying astrology at the same time. And so astrology, tarot, and flower essences early on were the three interests that I wove together constantly in my early work, and then became, in a sense, my own tapestry of what I would remain interested in throughout time. So I just want to mention that as I studied astrology, and as I tapped into indigenous teachings and the stories of plants and stars and planets and the sun and the moon and the respect and the honor of a whole universe, I could see that, oh my goodness, there's really no separation between we are a conduit between the heaven and the earth. And that in a sense, we communicate, we are a language of our own that can somehow express the mystery and the beauty of an entire universe. And so it became really exciting for me when I looked at an astrology chart to see it as a plant signature. It's like your astrology chart is your plant signature, and it holds within it the blossoming potential. And these thoughts were so intriguing to me and exciting that when I would work with a client with astrology, I would be able to see, in a sense, which flower essences could match their signature. And what I would call this would be the character flower essence. So that would, tap into the karmic imprint and the deep soul work we do as we incarnate. And found that also, when talking to a client about transits and progressions and different changes in the sense that we navigate through, that you could leave them with a great language in a sense, but to give them a little bottle of elixir that could assist them through the navigational course of their growth was especially magical. And so the context of bridging the astrology with flower essences began there, really. First, seeing that there's a wholeness and that we can't separate the language of stars and planets without the integration of plants and the music of the spheres of nature. And then to be able to give each person a little bottle of flower essences to assist them through the navigational process of growth and transformation.
That's just, there's so much richness to everything you just said.
Mm-hmm.
To like, maybe you could walk us through it a little bit. Like if a person comes to you for a consultation, and you, I would imagine, get their birth information and create their natal chart. What are some of the things that you look at in that chart, in the astrology, in order to determine what flower essences might be needed? And I would imagine there's maybe like a constitutional type of view with, and then maybe for the transits that you're talking about, maybe there's, are there two different types of formulas, or are they all integrated? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are two different types. The first type is, as you mentioned, and I had mentioned, the character essence. So within our chart blueprint, as I had spoken of, there are the geometry of the chart is the patterning of, you might say, numerical magic of an individual. Numbers and, the Pythagorean, power of number is so evident in the blueprint and the architecture of our soul. And so within the absolute beauty of an astrological chart, we see geometry. You see triangles, you see squares, you see sextiles, oppositions, and it all connects into an energy pattern that you're given. That original energy pattern is where we look for particular karmic imprints that an individual will recognize within themselves, and can be very healing for a total stranger to point those out, because again, it brings about personal forgiveness, acceptance, objectivity, all of those sort of feelings that we have when we know we carry a certain, quote, deficit, which I would call the original imprint. In the fairy tale, it's the curse. And this is where, of course, the magical meaning of fairy tales is also so beautifully connected. because we're all born with a quote curse, and we're all asked then to navigate through, initiate, follow through with the tasks it takes to conquer, to find courage to move through and find our true self amidst obstacle and challenge, and to be able to have those named from a total stranger that, okay, here, you're on your course and I'm going to name your obstacle course. This is again the character flower. So what I look for would be the angles to Saturn, which is karmic imprint, Saturn's squares, Saturn's oppositions. You want to know, you want to understand the different connection between, say, a moon square Saturn, a Venus square Saturn, an opposition to Mercury, and then powerful planetary aspects that can also be generational. So there's all these things that you look at, and then you find a way to soothe that kind of soul force within the individual so that they can find the inner courage and self-love to begin to move through the journey of their progressions and transits. So when I, or you or anyone meets with a client, they're well on their way, whether they're 20, whether they're 30, whether they're 90, we are on a course of a navigational course through our evolution until the day we pass this phase into the next. So we're always growing. And so when we look at the navigational course, which would be transits, progressions, we also can see flower essences that can help us through, you might say, a craggy road, sort of an emotional turbulence. And you can name those in advance. We don't know how it's going to work out exactly, but say, hey, you're on the map. Here's your, here's your course. And in about 6 months, you're going to hit this little bump in the road. Now, you and I don't know exactly how that's going to play out, but we know it's there. So we want to talk about it and say, what are the options? How can you best work through? And we can prescribe flower essences that will best help them to open their field of acceptance, to soothe their emotional anxieties, to cure or to work with mental, constructs that are confusing and fearful. So as we know, Edward Bach had, the 7 maladies of the soul that are most, dangerous or in the way of harmony and good health. And I'm not sure I can name them off the top of my head at this moment, but one of them, which intrigued me so much, was overenthusiasm. And I found that one very interesting. But have you ever met a person who just laughs kind of so weirdly and hysterically that it almost makes you uncomfortable, and they're always speaking in a high-pitched voice. And there's this kind of, I had never really understood how clear Edward Bach could see the soul, of any level of imbalance of a human soul. So overenthusiasm, fear, of course, I'm going to try and name them, and of course, my mind's going to go blank. But we know what they are. They're the parts of our life that will block us. Hesitancy, indecision is a really big one. So when we're moving through the chart, and we see these roadblocks, whether it be indecision, whether it be emotional trauma, whether it be being asked to change and move through whatever emotional obstacle has been in the way, we can talk about it, but talking about it is one thing, but bringing light into the cells and assisting with soul work is another. And I do want to mention that one of the deepest maladies for females in our world is body concept and the way we look at ourselves, the way we work with our own self-image and identity. So eating disorders and anything having to do with nurturing ourself and food is a really big piece of soul work that I've worked with for many, many years. And honestly, you can see that in the chart. You can see the lack of nourishment. You can see the lack of mother care that could turn into a food disorder. And there's so many, and the reason I'm mentioning this is because we know now that we cannot cure eating disorder or very deep maladies without spirit, soul, awareness, the evolution of consciousness to actually see a bigger picture that moves us out of shame, out of self-degradation, and away from that which makes us feel different than the rest of the world. I want to say that being a woman in growing up in my 20s in the 70s. That is something that we didn't have the information that's available now. And so we were busy reinventing and recovering, in a sense, retrieving work of the goddess, retrieving work of Tarot. It was a renaissance during the
Looks like our connection stalled for a second. Maybe we'll wait a minute here. Isha, can you hear us?
Yeah, I think we had a little bit of a blip here. The solar flares are having something to say. I was just listening to her, and hopefully she can still hear us, and we're just going to be restored in a moment. The thing that's really resonant for me is how she's talking about the chart, looking at the chart from the frame of seeing, where the wounding is. And we're back. Good.
Hey there, we lost you for a second.
You're still on mute.
And you're on mute though.
There we go.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah.
I was just reflecting on, you want to dive in, Ro? I was just reflecting on on how powerful it is to have the tool of flower essences when you're talking about the chart and, being able to see and identify the challenges, I mean, the curse in the words that you're using, from these mythic frameworks, and how it's not just, and there it is, and that's your life. It's going to be hard, or, this is a big challenge. Instead, we have the tool, we have the gift of, this is how we can transform this. This is how we can evolve. And then we find that inside that curse is a gift. Inside that curse can be our guiding light. I'd love to hear, your how you talk about this with your clients, because that's, to me, the most powerful thing about essences is they can help us transform these lifelong challenges into something really good.
I can't even tell you how much I love what you're saying, because that is absolutely the piece of creating inner child cards. It's about that original gift. And Edward Bach speaks of it, Rudolf Steiner speaks of it. It's also within the woven within the teachings of fairy tales, that we have an original purity and creative spirit, and yet becoming human gives us the opportunity to once again work with particular, whether they are past life, whether they're genetic. I mean, we don't really know. Now, again, with the study of epigenetics and how family origins tie into emotional constructs and whatnot, that there are these, again, constructs within the curse, within the kind of lessons that we come into life carrying, and that, in a sense, the lessons themselves are a gift to bring us back home. And we see that, and I just got little chills because I love it so much. Like the story of, the Wizard of Oz, and we know the Straw Man and the Tin Man and, the Lion and Dorothy. They're all on the yellow brick road on the path to finding something they think they don't have. And then they, of course, meet the wizard, and the wizard is like, not really a charlatan, but, he's like just a person behind with a big microphone. And what they all realize is everything they were searching for was in themselves all along. And of course, at the very end, Dorothy, with her magic red slippers, which connects to primal, connectedness to earth, and her incarnation is like, there's no place like home. And what we have is the opportunity to find our way back home to the original gift and joy of our incarnation. So everyone has their own curse, everyone has their own karmic imprint, and everyone has the opportunity to find their way through with courage, and to see that, yes, just like you said, that is the gift of incarnation, to actually travel and journey to find our way back to the beauty of our original self, in a sense.
And do you see, so you're talking about the individual curse and the individual karmic blueprint. But what about the more generational lessons, and then even bigger than that, kind of humanity lessons. And so I know with astrology, some of the slower moving planets can speak to generational aspects, right? How does that extrapolate, and how does that combine into what you do with your clients?
And that's super huge, and I love your question. And let's see, you're absolutely on target there, that the outer planets are going to connect us to generational energy patterns. So generally they'll go about 10 to 12 year patterns that are there. And so, for instance, in my generation, we were the generation, I'm born, shouldn't like tell the year I'm born, but it doesn't matter. I'm born in 1954. And so those of us who were born, during that time of the baby boomers, for instance, we're called the baby boomers. And one of the things that we have in common is that Pluto moved into Leo away from Cancer, where it had been in during World War II. And our parents all had Pluto, the farthest out at the time planet that connects into our way of creative regeneration. And so the Pluto and Cancer generation were about safety. They were about building white picket fences, and suddenly creating boundaries. And suddenly, there was a lot of divisiveness or a need to separate ourselves from country to country in order to, quote, keep ourselves safe. So this was like this really big consciousness that was happening during that era of the 30s and 40s and 50s. And then comes this baby boomer generation. And we've been raised in this kind of safety context, healthy or not healthy, whatever. But that was the energy pattern, was we have to keep ourselves safe. We have to make good money. We have to be, getting your dishwasher and your brand new Bel Air refrigerator, and make a life that is kind of like perfectly spaced in the neighborhood. Anyway, we come along and we say, no, we rebel. There's all this rebellion showing up in the baby boomer charts, where we want to be creative, we want to be musicians, we want to jump the fence, so to speak, and we want to find our way into other countries and learn about the world. And so in a lot of ways, we defied our parental guidance or our parental, messaging that said, you have to stay safe. We wanted to go out and explore the world, which again brought about a certain renaissance of thought and thinking, etc. Now, then comes the babies born in the 60s. And so what did they have? But they have a Pluto-Uranus conjunction, which in fact is also, for some of you, is opposite Saturn. That's huge. So you come in with this patterning, it's in Virgo, right? So what happens is these children born in the early, like say mid 60s to the late 60s, are born with this context of, I need to come to Earth and I need to help. Like on a soul force, there's like a band of helpers, like guardians of the Earth. It's Virgo. And they're like shooting down to Earth to say, the Earth is in trouble. We're going to make a difference. We want to be in service, right? They get to Earth and they find things are a mess. So the 60s and the early kids during that time are confused. It's like, and the world is changing. And we thought this was going to be a place to plant our feet as a sense, an emissary of Earth, and that we had so much to do. Well, at the first part of their life was to reconnect to the courage and the strength to stay on track. So you see a lot of kids that went off track, a lot of drugs, a lot of disillusionment, and terrible unknown factors that became more and more prominent in that generation around suicide. And the music became kind of incongruent and different, that we had more anger and frustration. And that's because of the disillusionment of what you thought you were going to find on Earth, but you find your way back to it. So what happens now is the children born in the 60s are adults now who are saying, who understand, I had to walk through a minefield in order to find my inner peace and to know, yes, now I find my service. The world needs me more now than ever. So here's the beautiful key, is that that generation are inventing new environmental remedies to help with climate change, to help with issues of energy on the planet. So now you can put all that good work to use. because the planet is ready now for the genius of that generation. So you've got Pluto, Uranus, opposite Saturn. Then you've got the kids born, which really was challenging, who had their sun and their moon connected right into that. I can't tell you how many astrology charts I worked with these patterns that were very difficult patterns to come in with, but they're so beautiful once you know the terrain and can work with what you've been given as the power of compassion, the power of service, and the power to use your understanding of chaos and disillusionment toward a better destiny and a better future. So, you know, the generations for the kids born during the early 90s, you know, they're the they're the Neptune in Capricorn with, what is it, Neptune Uranus? Gosh, my brain just went blank, but they have their own patterning there. That the same pattern that they were born with in the 90s is the same patterning many, like 100 years ago or so, when the Red Cross was developed, new institutions were brought into place, new ideas for global unity and to help with organizations that could change the world. And so this generation, the younger people born in the 90s and into the late 90s, are born with a genius to really make a difference. And for good or for bad, they're plugged into technology. So somewhere their little wiring, you know, was already able to utilize the higher technology and the wizardry of this really fast, high-paced energy and vibration. So yeah, I mean, each generation has its own gift, has its own malady. And also, you know, we look at Saturn in 2.5-year patterns as well. So, you know, and we look at a chart, someone's going through a Saturn return, someone's going through a second Saturn return, someone's going through a Saturn opposition. These are all points to reflect upon, and everybody will go through them. So they're like points of recognition that, okay, you're here, you're not alone. There are many people your age going through the exact same thing. Let's look at how you can best navigate it in your own personal life, in your own environment. Make the most of it, because we're always being triggered, and also we're given the opportunity to grow.
And isn't that the power of having the essences being a partner with the astrology, where you can see
Yes.
these patterns taking place, but there's also like, well, what are we going to do with it? How are we going to work through this? What are we going to use? What skills and tools are we going to use to help to transform these experiences that may be challenging, or that might be, it could be a big thing to carry through your life, having these oppositions or having this really significant aspect in your chart. And what do we do about it? Where do we, it becomes instead of only a burden, my life is difficult, it can become, my life can be transformed into something really beautiful and meaningful into the whole world. That to me is like the amazing gift of essence, especially when you're bringing together the lights of a chart.
That's so beautiful. And thank you for circling us back to the essences, because, Saturn and different angles to Saturn can bring about problems with authority, or a sense of a rebellion, a feeling of being limited, or that the construct is sort of coagulated with a sense of self-limitation. So there's so many beautiful essences that can help us. Saguaro cactus with authority, sunflower to help open up the field of ego consciousness to the point where we retain our humility. And I think that that's something that's so important. When we work with the plant world and the flower world, we find that they mirror to us the highest potential of humanity, that they remain eager and willing to change through the seasons. So of course we can look to flowers and plants as a means toward, accepting aging, accepting new budding consciousness, new growth. And we also know that if a plant or even a potted plant, or even, plants in the world that where climate is changing, if it's in the wrong environment, it's not going to grow. If it's not watered, it isn't going to grow if it doesn't have the right conditions. So the same for us as humans. If we're in the wrong environment, we're not going to grow. If we're in a toxic relationship, if we have a family situation that's traumatic, that we're not working through the emotional trauma, and that environment is in a sense limiting our ability to blossom and become fully individualized to who we are. If we aren't watering ourselves with self-nurturance and finding where it is we need to find the quote, right food, the food of the soul. So the flower essences will nourish, and they will bring light into the cells of our body, into the miasm where potential diseases are held, so that we come to understand, for instance, with medical astrology, you can see without foretelling, say, scary information. I would never do that. And I would never foretell a death, or, never, like, is astrology a fortune telling or a fearful tool? And some people feel scared to have their chart done because they are afraid, you're going to tell me something I don't want to know. Never is the case. A good astrologer is going to understand they're a storyteller like anything else. And so, for instance, say having a Saturn-Venus square in the chart, we know that that's generational on through the feminine archetype, and there's a limitation, and there's a bit of constriction in the heart chakra. Now, we also know, and having done this for so many years, over 40 years, and thousands of clients, I can pretty much tell anyone who has Saturn square Venus, especially if it's a tight square, that their family feminine origin might have a bit of arthritis, might have a bit of ligament rheumatism, this sort of thing, because that's connected to the constriction of love. And so we can work with flower essences that can help open the field of the heart. And one of my favorite fairy tale adages that comes out of Beauty and the Beast is, a broken heart is an open heart. And so when we can break the heart open and understand that it's not there to destroy us, but to open us to a field of unconditional love, compassion, and understanding, and we can work with flower essences that can help that individual, say, for instance, to work with their heart chakra, to work with the nurturance around their own body acceptance and the feminine archetype. So, and mother issues, and grandmother and ancestry shows up in the chart as well. So.
Again, my mind is just spinning and going off in all the directions of all the things you just said. It's hard to pick which one to respond to. There is just so much richness in everything that you're saying. And I was raising my hand when you were mentioning the children of the 60s. It really resonated with me, for sure. Then beyond the generational aspects, what about in like the bigger, grander, what's happening to all of us in this time on planet Earth? I don't know if you look at like the precession of the equinoxes or something else, and how do you read what what our collective selves are going through?
Yeah, I so love that question because it is twofold. I mean, on one level, we have our own template, and we have our own work to do, which is most important. And then there's the umbrella, or you might say, the canopy of stars, moon, planets that overlight us as a humanity. And knowing those larger cycles, that can be very complementary to help us understand an objective view of the tension that's in the world around us, or you might say the electrical buzz that's around us, or the higher frequency that is, overlighting us. So like you mentioned, absolutely, equinoxes, eclipses, following the moon phases, understanding the big, long cycle, like you say, outer planet aspects that are not only overlighting us in the sky, but they fall somewhere in our own personal chart. So the beauty is, as above, so below. Everybody may have that aspect. Like, say, for instance, recently over the last year has been the Saturn-Uranus square. It's huge. And it's been going on over a year plus, and it's also connected in with Saturn, with Mars, and it's created a lot of this kind of conflict and structural change. And it's like the old structure is wanting to be brought down, but it doesn't feel good. And there's protest, and it's almost like it's very similar also to the patterning of the 60s actually. And so once again, we're in this time in life where the status quo is being challenged. So on one level, the status quo is being challenged on a global scale, a global level, which connects into climate change and belief systems around it and decisions that are going to be made on a grander collective spectrum. And then how do we work with that inside ourselves? So knowing both can be so helpful. And on one level, it helps us not to take things so personal, but on another level, to take it so personal, so that we know that heal thyself is the master's grandest recipe for human evolution.
Are there any flower essences that you would recommend for the global energies happening today?
Yeah, absolutely. There are flower essences that I'm finding we need for anxiety. There's so much anxiety that these aspects are producing in the world at large. And of course, the pandemic and, this change in terms of our own isolation and trying to restructure our own life as it relates to our own fears. So yes, the essences for anxiety that I found are very helpful would be dandelion, aloe vera. There's the obvious ones of lavender and, soothing essences, but we also want to work with box white chestnut because it helps with mental chaos so that we can bring a sense of clarity into our dream world as well, because I find that a lot of people are having a trouble time sleeping. So white chestnut really helps to calm the mind, along with white magnolia is another flower essence that I have that has been helping people with rest and sleep. Anything having to do with fear. So we're looking at the mimulus family. We're working with, again, the Bach remedy, aspen, for unknown fear, because mimulus is fear for what we know, and aspen is for fears of the unknown fears. Very good for us right now as a collective to align ourselves, however, with a greater spectrum of community spirit. We want to work with sweet pea. We want to work with essences that help us to align with others so that we don't feel so isolated, because one of the maladies of ill health really is isolation. And we've really learned that, now through this pandemic, that for some people, especially extroverts who really don't like being alone, have found it particularly challenging. Introverts found it they liked it, like I get to spend time alone. I have every reason now to just, be alone, as long as we don't feel suffocated or, limited. So also essences like zinnia, to help with to keep our inner joy alive. So we want to work with essences such as zinnia. We want to work with buttercup. We want to work with the iris family. All of the essences that are the bulb family that deal with the nurturance and the watery realm. We need to really help our emotional body right now to move through fear, because fear is watery. And we also want to work through nurturance. So water your soul and look at your environment. And because we're in our environment so much these days, we want to look at, is it a nurturing place for me to be in? If not, how can I do little things to change my everyday routine? Or in some way to change a little bit about the way my diet, either helps me or not. I know for myself, admit the first part of the pandemic gave me every reason to have a glass of white wine every night. It was like, okay, time for white wine. It was like almost like I was reaching for something to help soothe me. I was busy working hard, a glass of white wine, and I realized, oh my goodness, this is not good for my health. This is not building my immune system. We need to be creating strong immunity right now, especially as we're trying to rid ourselves of this, deadly virus and everything else. We're never going to be rid of virus. So we have to really build our immune system so we can deal with a world that is going to bring more and more new diseases and conflicts and maladies into the world. I think that's just a reality that we're going to have to live with.
Thank you for sharing some essences, especially so that our listeners can kind of have some places to start working, because it's
Yeah,
wonderful to be able to work with us individually, but it's also
yeah,
as not everybody, that's not accessible for everyone. So we love to bring in possibilities for people to be connecting in ways that don't, that they can do on their own. It's the self-help that's
oh,
so
yeah.
useful. And then of course we do need other people to help us sometimes too, but it's good to have a place to start. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's been
Yeah.
really incredible. And we're really excited about the gift that you've given for our patrons. And we'll explain that in a minute. But first, I would love to how do our listeners learn more about you and what you do? How do they find out more about what your offerings are?
Oh, well, I do have my flower essence company, the Power of Flower Healing Essences. You can visit me at either ishalerner.com, and it's Lerner. A lot of people want to put an A in there, but it's Isha Lerner.com. You can also visit me at powerfloweressences.com. I have a new podcast I'm excited about called All Things Enchanted, and that is available on all your podcast, um, you know, whether it's Spotify, whether, it's YouTube, however you want to visit me through Apple. And I'm going to have a lot of guests and a lot of sharings about the power of enchantment. Um, Yes, and I would love to just mention that I love to hear from you. You can email me at ishalerner.com and learn about my publications, Inner Child cards, Power Flower cards, and the various flower essences that go along with the Power Flower cards, Tarot of the Four Elements, and Triple Goddess Tarot. So anyway, thank you so much for having me on and allowing me to share some of my work with your patrons and listeners.
The pleasure is definitely on the side as well. I mean, this has just been absolutely fantastic. I know you also have an Instagram, so we'll put a link there. What
Great.
is it? Power Flowers, I think, on Instagram.
Yeah, it's kind of
Mhm,
a funny one. So if you put a link to it, that'd be
mhm.
fantastic. I think they underlined it, which was kind of a bummer. So it's, I think, power underline of underlying flowers or something, but you can look up for Isha Lerner as well. Um, and yes, I'd love you to join my Instagram. We're really having fun with it. And there's going to be a lot going on it pretty soon. And my
And
Facebook. Yes, all of it.
and so, yeah, you have graciously offered a gift for our patrons. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was so fun. I created an audio for your patrons that pretty much covers the question you asked about what are the cycles that are going on a grander scale right now that we can be aware of, and what are some of the flower essences that can assist us through them. And you'll learn some things about the throat chakra, some of the areas that there are blocks and essences that can assist us through the different maladies that greet us through these challenging times.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a delight meeting you, and I've just been so great to share this time with you. There's so much richness and depth here. I hope that we can sometime in the near future come and spend time with you again, because there's so many more things that we could talk about. But
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining us. It's been
Oh my
really
gosh,
great.
thank you for inviting me. I've really enjoyed it.
All right. Well, until next time, thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll look forward to meeting you in the garden again soon.
Bye bye now.